Thank you all for coming today. We expect this to be a very entertaining and enlightening panel discussion. Let me start off by apologizing that due to the vagaries of the Senate schedule, Senator Gardner is not going to be able to attend and join us this morning. For reasons we can only speculate, the Senate announced earlier this week that there would be no roll call votes for the rest of the week, and so as a longtime former Senate staffer, I know that means senators scatter to the wind, especially since they didn't have much of an August recess. So Senator Gardner headed back to his state and unfortunately was not able to join us this morning. We had particularly looked forward to his comments because, as you know from looking at the invitation, he's chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's subcommittee on East Asia, Pacific, and cybersecurity. And his committee recently held 2 hearings to focus on the China's hegemonic actions and strategies, even within their own region. And of course, our subject today looks at the focus of China and Russia's investment in development, economic development strategies beyond not only their immediate regions, but around the world, as we'll hear our panelists describe. Joining us today are Shanthi Kalathil, who's director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies. She will be moderating our panel, and coming from my right to my left is CIPE's executive director, Andrew Wilson, and then Lola, and sorry Lola, I don't see your last name. Okay. And Lola is an Africa-based CIPE program officer based in Nigeria and is an expert focusing on anti-corruption projects on the continent, and is fortunate enough to be here in Washington to join us this week. And then on the other side of Shanthi is Claude Fontheim, who's the CEO of Fontheim International and is a very well-regarded expert on international business and also sits, in the interest of full disclosure, sits on CIPE's board of directors, but has a number of affiliations that I'm sure we can get into, and is seen as a really expert on the ability or the interaction of businesses with civil society and promoting good democratic governance, rule of law, labor standards, and other types of democratic norms. And then immediately to my right is Marc Schleifer, who is the regional director for Europe, Eurasia, South Asia, and is about to take on a new position that he can describe in due course, and as director of our business development program. My name is Greg Wilhouk. I am the director of congressional and government relations at CIPE, again, former Senate staffer, and any of you who are working for Hill offices, please get a card from me later, and I'd like to talk to you later further about all the great work that CIPE is doing around the world. So let me quickly introduce Shanthi, and then she can recognize the other panelists to give their brief introductions and resumes. Shanthi is the director of the International Forum of Democratic Studies, as I said, with the National Endowment for Democracy. Her work is focused primarily on issues pertaining to democratization, development, and the impact of information and communication technology, with a particular emphasis on Asia. Previously in her career, she served as a senior Democratic Fellow at the U.S. Agency for International Development and as an associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and as a non-resident associate with the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University, and just to fill out that resume, as a consultant for the World Bank, the Aspen Institute, and other international affairs organizations. Shanthi has appeared on media including NPR, BBC, VOA, RFA, C-SPAN, and other networks and platforms, and has authored or edited numerous policy and scholarly publications, including Diplomacy, Development, and Security in the Information Age, and was a former Hong Kong-based staff writer for the Wall Street Journal. We have a paper, one of the Institute's papers out there in front. Hopefully you were able to pick it up, called Sharp Power, which focuses on many of the same aspects of the subject matter of today's panel discussion. So without further ado, Shanthi, let me hand it over to you, and we look forward to your comment and those of our fellow panelists. Thank you.
Is this working? Okay, terrific. So as Greg mentioned, I'm Shanthi Kalathil, Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm delighted to be able to be here today to help CIPE launch their terrific new paper, Protecting Democracies Amid a Flood of Corrosive Capital. If any of you have been paying attention to the news, and it's really impossible to not see the flood of headlines that have dominated global discourse recently that pertain to exactly this topic, and whether you're looking at Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, there are always stories that relate back centrally to this key theme. And the idea that there's a particular type of capital flowing from authoritarian countries that poses distinct dangers to democratic discourse and democratic society is one that we've been exploring as well at the NED. And so I think it's terrific that we can work together with partners such as CIPE to help extend and push forward this discourse and push forward learning on these issues. In the report, you'll see, and as we proceed through the discussion today, I think we'll hear from a number of experts on country case studies and specific examples from the countries that are examined here, including Kenya, countries in the Balkans, and so on. And I think when you take it together, they make a very persuasive case that corrosive capital, in CIPE's terminology, is something that we in the US, as well as policymakers throughout established democracies, need to be paying much more close attention to. So since Greg already provided a brief introduction of our panelists, I'll perhaps not introduce everybody right now, but we'll have a brief conversation and discussion starting with Andrew and then proceeding through the rest of the panel. And then after we do that, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So Andrew, would you like to start us off with a brief introduction of the report?
Great. Thank you, Shanthi. My name is Andrew Wilson, as you know. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise. And before I get too far into the meat of our comments, let me reference as to how we came to be looking at this issue of corrosive capital and why it matters so much to an organization like CIPE. CIPE is an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're a business institute, but we work at the intersection of markets and democracy around the world. And our business model really puts the focus on working with local partners in emerging markets and emerging democracies to address issues of private sector operating environments, which can include things like corruption, good governance, rule of law, et cetera. And a couple of years ago, our partners in Southeast Asia in particularly, and then later in Africa, started coming to us with a problem or a concern that we hadn't seen before at CIPE to the extent we're seeing it now. And it was at a time when China was announcing its Belt and Road commitments of $60 billion, and then, as we know recently, they've just announced another $60 billion of what they call Belt and Road construction projects. But accompanying these large infusion of infrastructure-related funds was a similarly large and probably larger flow of funds that came under the guise of loans and also private capital. And an influx of Chinese investment that was starting to move through markets with unforeseen impact on governance structures in countries. And by unforeseen, I mean people could already start to judge that these funds were having a somewhat negative effect on governance through corruption or through lax practice, and a concern that this effect could continue or be exacerbated in future. The other side of it is a lot of these capital funds weren't necessarily transparent, and therefore there wasn't a lot of information available to people who really wanted to try and understand where this money was coming from, how it was entering the country, and what its ultimate impact was going to be on the local economy and the development of the local private sector. So it was from these initial questions that we started getting from the field that we started looking at these broader questions ourselves. We were also being encouraged by friends in other economies around the world to say, look, this isn't just a phenomena of Chinese investment, but this is a concern we have, a growing concern that we have about capital flows from a variety of authoritarian states. So about the same time, we also started being approached by partners in the Balkans to say, we're really looking at the phenomena of Russian investment in our country as well. And this all, if you will cast your minds back, also came within a time of the post-2008 economic crisis, when the dominant philosophy that was holding sway in most economies was based on market dynamics and democracy, and a lot of those started to come under question. And therefore, the visibility of these types of investment projects and whatnot were also growing in influence and in the public interest. So we started taking a look at these issues, and I'll get into some of our conclusions in just a minute. But what we did realize at the time was that this is a global phenomenon, and we needed to figure out a way that we could define it and better talk about it, especially in the relationship with how this relates to markets and democracy and good governance. So we came up with the term corrosive capital, and I've defined it for the purposes of this session as saying capital flows primarily from authoritarian states to weak and young democracies that exploit and or have a potential negative effect on governance structures. And as I said, many countries participate in this type of investment, but Russia and China seem to be at the state of the art as practitioners at this point. Now, we chose the term corrosive capital very carefully because we realized and accept that, like acid, all foreign investment doesn't have the same effect. If you will, some foreign investment is more corrosive than other forms of foreign investment. And we really needed to distinguish about sort of the level of harmful effect that these capital flows could have on local economies. And we needed to distinguish how they might differ from just, as we might say, ordinary capital flows that will tolerate a high level of risk in an emerging market. Whether that risk might be corruption or other factors. We need to say what is relatively benign forms of flow versus what is something that's highly corrosive. So if we apply a pH to this sort of thing, we could say something with a low acidity, what might be something like private investment flows. Let's say something from a country like Turkey or somewhere else that has a high tolerance of a corrupt environment. It might pay a bribe to an official, a petty bribe to get some access or to get some sort of problem solved quickly. It's using the existing poor business practices and poor governance practices in a state, but ultimately isn't really harming the state or the interests of the state. It's not doing it any good, but it certainly isn't having a drastic negative, net negative effect on it. Slightly higher up the pH level or acidity level would be what we would determine as sort of a medium acidity. And that might be more of what we're looking like in terms of Belt and Road projects emanating from state loans that have a certain degree of transparency. But what our information is telling us probably feed a higher level of corruption within a country, might rely on weak governance practices such as bad procurement policy or other things to direct contracts to certain entities, might avoid labor standards and environmental standards along the way, and generally start to degrade the practice of governance or take advantage of poor governance structures and further speed their weaknesses along. So if we hear the stories that you might hear from, say, some of the African states when we talk about railroad construction or other projects, those might fit into those categories. Ultimately, the state will still exist, but it may not be better off for it. And certainly the positive effects of international finance that we've seen in past are not being put into practice. Finally, we have what we would refer to as highly corrosive or highly acidic types of investment programs. And I would characterize those as investments that are leveraged for more overt geopolitical goals and ends, whose purpose is really in the end to influence social stability and or decision-making in weak democracies. And often these decisions are made against the long-term interests of the state. The studies we've done in the Balkans that Marc will talk about a little later are one indicator of where we really see patterns of ownership, patterns of investment that are directly tied to political agendas in the Kremlin that are then leveraged to advance Kremlin foreign policy goals. And quite often these can take the guise of private investment or state investment, but they do tend to hide a little bit lower under the radar, and Marc will talk a little bit about that. So as I mentioned, I think there's three types of mechanism here that we need to look at when we talk in terms of corrupt capital, the first being state loans. And I think there we're seeing headlines in a lot of newspapers where countries are starting to deal with the impact of bad state lending practices, Sri Lanka being the most recent example in which we see loans taken by the Rajapaksa administration for a dubious port construction project in southern Sri Lanka have now moved the ownership of that facility to China because the state could not service its loans. This is the big difference, and I think this is where we talk about one of our governance leaks or democracy links. You know, the difference between these types of loans and the traditional finance structures we see coming from, say, the World Bank or other multilaterals is that often these loans are collateralized with the natural resources of a country or other things that, other elements in that country. The interest rates are not nearly at the same level that you would normally associate with a multilateral loan or a state loan. The interest rates are often higher. You know, I've referred to these as sort of the payday loan system of international finance. It's a loan that's very easy to get. The terms are a little more harsh, but if you can't service the loan, the ultimate impact can be ruinous. And we're seeing that in Sri Lanka in practice, but I would also point out that we've seen and through our studies in other parts of the world, such as Latin America, we're also seeing that these loans aren't necessarily on the books of countries, that novel approaches have been taken by governments to actually acquire these loans. So for instance, in Argentina, while there might be separate laws that govern the loan itself that have been passed by the parliament, these loans aren't even kept on the books of the state, so they're not recognized as state debt. They are non-transparent in the way they are made, and the public does not have an ability to monitor what's going on with this loan making and the obligations that the state is taking in a very accessible way. So this lack of transparency in the loan process becomes critical in those terms. In terms of aid projects, I will point to the Belt and Road as an example of where this is problematic. We're not saying that the Chinese government should step back from the procurement, the aid process, that Chinese capital doesn't have a role to play. But what we are saying is that if you're going to be a participant in helping countries develop their infrastructure and to play that role, this really needs to be done in a more transparent way. So when we look at things like procurement standards and whatnot that tend to happen when these Belt and Road projects are put into place, what do we see? We see very limited procurements, procurements that often are designed in such a way that international firms can't compete with the tender process, and awards are made to firms that don't have to comply with international labor standards or don't comply with environmental standards, et cetera. And this is part of the nature of why we're concerned with this corrosive capital flow, is that it also creates a non-competitive environment for a lot of business around the world, even local businesses which don't get access to these projects. And the concern there is also that we might be creating a vicious cycle in terms of driving down standards, and I'll get to that in just a second. And then finally, there's the question of private investment. And even here, I'll make a distinction between private investment from countries which have a high risk tolerant and private investment from countries that have a deeper political agenda that they're moving forward with. And this is a case where we see, what is the actual nature of the private sector in the country from where these investments are originating. And when we look at authoritarian capital, quite often the private sector is very closely tied to the state itself. So if you're seeing a crony system like the Soviet, or like Russia, in which we're seeing companies very close to Kremlin ownership, if not owned by the Kremlin themselves, being used as vehicles for investment, I think we can tie a pretty definite line of causality there. There's also, I think, if we look at Chinese investment patterns, and we won't tar all Chinese firms with the same brush, but it's often said that there are two types of firms in China, those that are owned by the state and those that are controlled by the state. And in the case of the Chinese private sector, it's often very difficult to draw a line to say where are the lines of control of these firms when it comes to investment. So there might be private ownership within the firm, but certainly the Communist Party of China still wields influence within these firms. And a lot of these firms have financing structures that are tied to Chinese state banks and other elements, which may also enable us to call into question the actual independence of an investment when it's made in a country. So what's different between corrosive capital and what I'll refer to as constructive capital? Well, in summary, constructive capital, which we could deem as, good guy capital, capital from the West, brings best practice with it, both in terms of demanding better public governance, but also in private standards. It's if you will, the benchmark of investment that countries want to attract when they're looking for foreign investment, because they recognize that these firms will bring with them strong practice. It raises the bar for other companies to participate. It raises the bar on public governance, and it reinforces, incentivizes, and rewards good governance practices. Corrosive capital provides no incentive, and at best worsens practice and contributes to corruption. We even noted in a study that this is not just public corruption directly affiliated to the project itself, but we've noted that in corruption studies in some countries have noted that in places where you have major projects going into place, corrosive capital projects, even the standards within the local private sector start to drop within the reach of these projects. So it's lowering standards itself at the local level as well. That corrosion tends to spread very quickly. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, others pay the price. There are victims to bad lending practice, and it's the citizens of the countries that take these loans who have their own natural resources and the wealth of their country collateralized without their say and without their participation. So why should we, as people who are concerned with democratic practice and democratic support, be concerned about this? Well, as I mentioned, first off, it corrodes governance. Procurement, transparency, corruption all suffer as a result of it. Second, it turns the norms of democracy on their head. We like to think that a functioning democracy, a functioning society, has norms of participatory governance, where people can see what their government is doing on their behalf, where information is transparent, and where people have a say in the decision-making of their government when obligations of this sort are being taken on behalf of the citizens. And in this case, and often in these cases, these are not transparent deals. And the citizens do not have access to the information they need to participate in this type of decision-making. And on the back side of it, they're not getting the levels of participation they deserve in terms of how this money's getting spent either. So it's not only the taking of the loan, it's the spending of the loan. Because you're not seeing access, you're not getting access to the accounts and how money is being spent. And in effect, if, as we suspect, and I say suspect because economic information can be very difficult to get out of these firms and out of these projects, we're just starting to learn how to dig into this information. But in effect, a citizen of Ghana or a citizen of Kenya may be paying for corruption in China itself. because quite often these projects are overvalued, and we can't see the nature of the deal between the Chinese finance of a project and the Chinese construction of a project. So the lack of transparency that exists in the expenditure side of the column is also very troubling and goes against the norms of democracy we'd like to see adopted. And then the third area is much more malign, and that's how these funds are being used to drive social and political influence. And again, Marc will talk on this about the Balkans briefly, but if you look at patterns of ownership in the Balkans, they tend to be concentrated in places like media, sports, energy, all areas where public opinion can be shaped and directed. And we've seen governments in that region make decisions that do run counter to the popular interest of the country, and we can draw lines back to how these different tools are being used directly to do that. And finally, if we think on a global practice, corrosive capital erodes global norms. So, you know, the old idea of think globally, act locally. A lot of what we want to do in terms of promoting democracy at a local level, at a country level, is driven by global norms. Whether it's an OECD standard or WTO standard, we need and we use global standards and global norms to help drive local aspirations to be better governed societies. If we look at the debate over the internet, I think that's a broad illustration, not necessarily tied to corrosive capital, but certainly a place where we are seeing a global norm or a push towards adjusting global norms affect our own freedom here in our country as we debate whether or not countries should be able to govern the internet themselves, or whether that should be something that's global and based on free and open access. Well, that same kind of debate goes on in economic circles as well. It goes on in corporate governance, it goes on at the company level, and what we're seeing right now is a vacuum, if you will, that's emerged since the 2008 financial crisis, when globalization and those standards came into question, and the ability of these types of practices to start us questioning our own commitments to transparency and democracy, and certainly local practice, become much more challenged within that. As a business community, why should we be concerned? Well, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of competitiveness, it's very difficult for a Western firm, which is law-abiding and well-versed in things like labor standards, to compete in tenders and in projects where those standards are no longer being held high. And what we've learned about practice in corrosive capital, in particular in Chinese investment practices, is they will only be as good as the local standard being asked of them. So, you know, this is something where we can shout from the rooftops, but if we're not addressing things at a local level and improving standards at a local level, the Chinese will just work to that level. So if they are using corruption at a local economy to drive a procurement process that's not going to be rigorous, Western companies are going to suffer from that and are suffering. There's a more complex and nuanced issue when we talk about flows of investment as well. You know, I can speak as someone who's been involved in the practice of trying to, and CIPE is an organization that's been involved in the practice of trying to extend good ethical business norms through investment practices for many years. And we relied on things like public offerings and other tools like capital markets to drive reform and to drive good corporate behavior in emerging markets. You know, international finance has changed over the last 10 years. We've moved away from IPOs and we're moving towards private investment. And what we're finding is that private investment is now much more vulnerable because we don't have those levers. They don't act in the same transparent markets. And so they don't have the same ability to influence corporate behavior that they once had. And what we're seeing is now that we've got competing capital moving into these markets from China, our ability to even compete on investment projects becomes hampered. So we were talking to some colleagues who are trying to do investment projects in Ukraine right now. And they say, you know, our challenge is we've got the capital, we're willing to take the risk, we can't find the partners. Because what we're seeing are capital flows from markets that aren't going to demand better governance come in, and it's an easier deal for the local partner to make. And therefore, we're losing our ability to invest in these markets. if we're losing the ability of our own people to participate in these markets, we're also losing our ability to promote higher standards among local business communities. And ultimately, I think why we should all be concerned here in this room is that we will ultimately carry the costs of this bad loan making. We're already seeing a debate in Pakistan, which has overextended itself with its Chinese loans, about how the IMF will bail out the country. You know, it used to be just accepted practice that if we had bad debt, it probably was, at least it came with some good practice. Now we're finding ourselves being asked to bail out countries because of bad lending practice, because of overextension, because there was a lack of accountability within these societies. And we as taxpayers in the United States are going to start carrying part of the cost for the fact that bad lending decisions are being made between Chinese investors or Russian investors and local counterparts. And I think that should concern us even more, because not only is this are the potential ramifications here about where some of our tax funds may go, but to us it also portends something a little more worrying. If we're seeing this level of bad decision making being allowed both in emerging markets but amongst Chinese lending, so you know the Chinese are having to eat a lot of bad debt right now, whether it's in Venezuela or in Sri Lanka. What you're seeing is bad lending practice being put into place. What does that portend for what's happening that we're not seeing in China itself between Chinese state banks and Chinese state enterprises? You know, let's not forget that Chinese banks hold a great deal of our debt as well. If we start to see a failure in the Chinese financial markets because of an extension of what we're seeing in international lending at the domestic level, that's going to affect all of our 401ks at some point. And so it can be a pocketbook issue for everybody in this room as well. So it behooves us, I think, when we look at the nature of this issue, to come out strongly and say we really do need to be looking at how countries acquire debt, the ability of this to be done more transparently. The good news is there's things that can be done. This is not a situation in which there is no solution. We know what can be done. We know who the players are. We're already noticing that the Chinese are starting to recognize that they have liabilities here from sort of a practice that was allowed to run rampant for a few years. But the focus really needs to be not on China, but on the local market. Right? As I said earlier, we're not advocating that Chinese money doesn't flow into emerging markets. It's needed. It's a huge amount of money. It's got a role to play. We also realize that trying to shape Chinese corporate behavior is not going to be done through the government in Beijing, because we already know that what drives Chinese corporate behavior and Chinese state lending behavior is local standards. So what we need to focus on as a matter of strategy is how we improve local standards. Standards in Kenya or Ghana or in Sri Lanka, that when these deals are first offered, that citizens have access to that information, that procurements are done well, and that fairness and transparency become a hallmark of these local practices, not an outlier. And I will wind up my comments there. Thank you, Shanthi.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a terrific introduction to a complex issue. I was really struck by your emphasis on how CIPE came to this issue, which was not from a top-down, we're going to look at Russia and China perspective, but rather understanding from your partners on the ground in several developing economies how they were seeing the effects of these things. So it really, I think, brings home that this is not really something that can be examined only from the perspective of examining authoritarian governments, but also understanding the interplay with the local conditions on the ground, which is really where you see these huge impacts. Lola, I wanted to turn to you next. You're based in Nigeria, and you've also had extensive experience as an anti-corruption expert and working on financial compliance, I guess, in a previous life. And so I know in the report you've cited many examples of the ways in which Chinese capital is having a number of effects in countries of the subcontinent, of the African subcontinent. So perhaps you could just give us a few of your opening thoughts on that, and if you don't have time to get into each of the individual studies, we can always come back to those in a bit.
Hi, good morning. All right, thank you, Shanthi. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Andrew, for that very interesting background on corrosive capital. I feel like every time I hear my colleagues talk about this concept, I learn something new every time. So, I mean, given I've been researching and reading about this for a while, I'm still learning about it. So if you do have questions, which if you might, feel free to direct all of them to Andrew. And he'll be happy to answer them. But I think it's interesting that, we were talking about corrosive capital, and in the context of Africa, the dominant player is China, and this discussion is coming right on the heels of maybe you might have seen the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that happened on the 3rd and 4th, I think, last week. But this attracted, I think, somewhere about 50 leaders, 50 heads of states from the African continent. I think that's a very huge voting bloc. But this happened in Beijing. And the last time I checked, the African Union headquarters is in Addis. But that tells you something about the Africa-China relationship, which is growing and getting really strong. And at this forum, President Xi promised or pledged another $60 billion for development funding and aid to the continent, which, if you think about it, most of the countries on the continent are, in the very early stages of industrialization. And, a lot of, African countries have huge infrastructural deficits. And so this is a development fund, like Andrew was saying, that is important. But when you start to think about it in the context of foreign aid or foreign assistance, then you start to wonder, okay, so how is this benefiting the African states? And that's where we started to wonder if, like you see in the papers, these funds coming into the states create what you call a debt trap for these countries down the road. There are several examples we'll get into. Some of the key ones are maybe Zambia, Sierra Leone. How is this serving national interest? And so in the research, one of the things we were trying to get at is, okay, obviously, this is harming the domestic economy, and this is, if this is happening, then of course, there's less participation of the citizens in making these decisions about these investments that come from, Chinese government institutions. And so we started to look at, we said, let's try to see how these projects are implemented and how these funds are, channeled into the countries, and particularly, to see how they undermine democratic governance. And so we looked in Ghana. I know I have 3 minutes, but I'll quickly say that, we started to see a pattern which was consistent or common across, many of the countries where there's a lot of Chinese investment. And that was really the fact that the process of agreements really exploited governance gaps, in the sense that they tried to avoid procurement standards in many of these countries. So many of these countries have fairly, robust procurement laws and standards that, have been built into local law, but also have come to some countries as part of the standards and norms that traditional lenders have, established or guided these countries to develop over time. And with capital coming from Beijing most of the time, it comes with the strict condition that, these projects, these huge infrastructural projects, should not follow those standards, which means, no open bidding. And of course, the non-transparency is a common trend in most of these large infrastructural projects. And so you start to see down the road where the problems arise. So where there's no open bidding, you see examples in Sierra Leone and in Uganda where a lot of the projects are overpriced. So there are roads, the examples of roads that were built in Sierra Leone that cost 300%. I'm a horrible mathematician, but it works out to somewhere about 300% more expensive than the average if you had open competition. There's an ongoing conversation between Tanzania and Kenya about the standard gauge rail that was built in Kenya and is currently built in Tanzania. And when Kenya got the funding, this was built by the Chinese CIPE. It's a Chinese firm that was earmarked to get that contract because it was funded by the Export-Import Bank of China. When that was built, that didn't go to open bidding, and so this happened. And then Tanzania also had similar agreement with the Export-Import Bank initially, and said, well, no, we're going to open bidding, and then they did. And it turned out they arguably got a better deal, because they got a greener system, they got a more efficient system, they say. And so there's that running debate about whether these projects are overpriced, whether they're the best and the most efficient for the countries that get them. And so we'll get into some more issues too about local content sourcing. When these deals are reached, there's no conversation about, well, where do you get the staff from, the people who would build these rails? There's huge unemployment challenges in many of these countries, and unskilled labor is something that you can easily get in any African country. But that's an issue that comes up across the continent. That's consistent across the continent. Only in some countries there's pushback, like Kenya. But still, these are challenges that local and domestic, the citizens in most of these countries don't get the opportunity to weigh in on because of how these deals are reached, and also then that flows to how the projects are implemented. And so, as maybe in the course of I know I'm over 3 minutes, but in the course of the discussions, we'll talk about other trends that we see that worries who I'll call custodians of democracies in these countries, and those are the partners that CIPE works with to strengthen democratic governance, which is around the investment from China in the media space. That's something that's growing and becoming disturbing. And Andrew also started to talk about the erosion of global standards and norms in many of these countries. So I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to obey and keep to time, so I'll hand it over to Shanthi.
Thank you, Lola. And I will come back to you on the issue of Chinese government investment in African media outlets, because I think that's also quite timely. Let's turn now to Marc Schleifer, though, because I know that, Marc, you've done some work here in the report as well as elsewhere looking at this and at this issue of corrosive capital, but specifically with respect to Russia and perhaps the Balkans. And maybe you could let us know how that differs or is similar to some of the examples that Lola's mentioned.
Sure. Thank you very much, Shanthi. And I would be remiss if I didn't also recognize that this is a team effort. This is work that's carried out by CIPE staff working on our Europe-Eurasia division and with partners across the Balkans. So, well, I thank you, Shanthi, for saying that I've done the work, but really this is a team project at CIPE. Andrew and Lola are certainly hard acts to follow, and just as Lola said, she always learns from Andrew. I always learn from listening to her remarks when she spends time with us in the DC office. So thank you very much. So I'd like to just touch very briefly on a couple of distinctions and similarities between the situation that I think we're all very familiar with or becoming more familiar with Chinese investment around the world and what the patterns of Russian investment are in the Balkans, because I think by looking at those similarities and differences, I think we can glean some very interesting lessons. First, I would say, it's pretty apparent that China has global intentions, a global reach, what appears to be a global investment strategy with the Belt and Road Initiative, and the conventional wisdom, at least, we know that Russia is a much weaker economy overall, and so we have this sort of conventional wisdom that's emerged that Russia's investment in the Balkans is much more sort of from a political point of view to play spoiler, to try to derail the region's Western integration. And that is definitely part of the story, and I'll touch on that a little bit in my remarks. But I just want to note that there's some other factors at play as well that can make it a little bit hard to sometimes disaggregate what's going on in the region. In the Balkans, it just might be the case, and we've seen this, that this is where Russians are comfortable investing. There are, various historic, cultural ties. There are business ties dating back to socialist days. That just make this sort of an easy place for Russians to come and invest and to park their money. It also might be, and this is, for those of you who are sort of Kremlinologists in the room, that, this might be where a lot of wealthy Russians are choosing to park their money in case something goes wrong back home, and they need to be able to access their money. So I think it's important to, add a little bit of subtlety to our analysis from that point of view. There are also some other things that I think are going on in the region, and I think this is a commonality that something that Andrew talked about, the degree of receptivity of different countries to Chinese capital. We know that the Balkans are still very corrupt regions. They have a lot of their own internal kleptocratic networks, and that makes it a very welcoming place for Russian capital to come in. I think another similarity, and Andrew touched on this a little bit as well, it can be hard at times to disaggregate what are the actions of the Russian state from what are those of Kremlin-connected firms. People don't become billionaires in Russia by accident, and it's pretty easy to see whether this money is, if it's not purely Kremlin-owned firms, government-owned firms, it's state-connected firms, or at least some of this investment activity is done with the blessing of the state or in consultation with the state. We call them oligarchs, I think, for a reason, right? We also have to look at a couple of interesting myths about Russian investment in the Balkans. There's this sort of perception, I think, particularly in the region among folks in Serbia in particular, and in Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that Russia is this important benefactor and is investing a lot in the region. If you actually start to look at the amount of money that Russia puts into the region, they're actually investing much less than the European Union. And in fact, based on the research that our partners have done in the region, Russia's economic footprint in the Balkans has actually decreased since the 2008 financial crisis and since the imposition of sanctions following Russia's invasion of Crimea. But yet there is this strong perception that Russia is there and supporting the people and making all these important strategic investments. And that's, I think, because they very deftly combine it with what the Ned has termed sharp power. So the investments that they make in the economy are combined with support for cultural institutions, religious institutions, media outlets, sports teams, as Andrew alluded to, and the like. If you look at some of the numbers, and some of these numbers can be hard to pull out, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Over the last 10 years, official European investment in the Balkans that we can track is 20+ billion euros, whereas Russia has invested just 4 billion euros in the region. So why do we have this outsized notion of, or impression of the significance of Russian investment? Because they've very wisely chosen the strategic sectors that they invest in. That's energy, mining and minerals, real estate, finance, and these are firms that both have a lot of impact on everyday people's lives. If you're talking about energy prices in particular, they also happen to be firms that are very closely connected with Kremlin-connected owners or flat-out state-owned enterprises. So those are the types of patterns that we start to see. Another interesting aspect of this that I think is rather unique to the Balkans, we have to look at the issue of ultimate beneficial ownership. When you start to look at the firms that are, the Russian-connected firms that are investing in the Balkans, because a lot of this money moves through various complex networks in Europe, through European banks, it can actually be very hard to get to the bottom of how much money is actually being put in, and it can be very hard to trace back what the source of this money is. And I'm very happy in the Q&A a little bit to talk about some of the methodology that CIPE and our partners have used to try to figure out, where this money actually comes from and who really owns this money. So I think, maybe I'll pause on that point there and turn it back to you, Shanthi. I know we definitely want to hear from Claude. So, and happy to take questions later on.
Great, thank you, Marc. Why don't we turn to Claude now? Claude, you bring a particular perspective, having worked in the private sector for a number of years, and particularly on corporate social responsibility issues. So from your standpoint, what are you seeing from business and private sector actors in response to this trend of corrosive capital? How worried are they, and what steps are they taking to address this?
Yeah, so thanks, Shanthi. My approach in my brief remarks is a little different from the others. It's a perspective from American business. And let me just say, it's an incredibly broad topic, so I'll just pick a few pieces of the puzzle. What does eroded governance and rule of law in these countries do to affect American businesses? Well, it happens in both commercial, it's harmful in a commercial sense, and it also interferes with their social responsibility objectives. Commercially, for example, one of many examples would be theft of intellectual property rights. So the IP Commission, the Intellectual Property Rights Commission, a US-based organization, estimates that between $225 billion and $600 billion worth of U.S. intellectual property is stolen each year globally. Now, the countries we're talking about are a subset of that, but it gives you an indication of the size of the impact on the U.S. economy, businesses, and workers here in this country, particularly where industries that are based on innovation and creativity play such a huge role in the economy. So intellectual property theft of various kinds is a big problem. And it's not just about counterfeit goods taking sales away from the authentic products, or software being pirated, or movies and music being pirated. It also affects consumers of these companies. So let's say, for example, there's a big problem with counterfeit auto parts. Counterfeit auto parts tend to be of inferior quality and can actually be dangerous to the consumer when they get parts replaced on their automobile and they're driving an unsafe car because the components are counterfeit. Another area in which it affects U.S. business is lost sales, lost investment deals of various kinds, because, as others have mentioned on the panel here, U.S. companies are bound by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and there's a whole range of behaviors that are prohibited on pain of federal prosecution and jail time if you directly or indirectly bribe foreign officials. It's a broad statute, and if you're competing with businesses or banks in countries that don't have similar laws, you miss out on important opportunities. For example, in the government procurement field, this is a big problem, and U.S. companies in the infrastructure sector, just as one example, lose out on business opportunities because their ability to play that game is non-existent as long as they're abiding by the law. And because of the criminal penalties, U.S. companies tend to take that really, really seriously. But at the same time, it means that for the countries that are procuring infrastructure or medical devices or you name it, they're not getting the best product at the best price because competitors from the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere are precluded from competing as suppliers by corruption of public procurement authorities. Another example is U.S. companies for all kinds of products rely on global supply chains. Corruption of customs officials is a problem in impeding the efficient operation of global supply chains. Some of these supply chains have to move extremely fast and efficiently. And that's a big change from where we were at one time. There was a time when the expectation was you could plan well ahead in your sourcing and production targets, but in some sectors like apparel now, there's a need to turn product around very fast. So any impediments that slow down your ability to have product manufactured and brought into the United States is a big problem if you can't grease the wheels at the ports with payments. This has even gotten to the point where there are apparel companies now that have product manufactured in countries where shipping is too slow and the products are flown in by jet, because retailers now in the fast fashion sector often chase what's selling. So you'll go to H&M or the Gap and there'll be a variety of sweaters. If the purple sweater in this style is selling and the green sweater isn't, they want to replenish stock of the purple sweater within days. Not weeks, not months, I mean, as used to be the case. So they want the factory to, on a dime, start cranking out the purple sweaters, put them on large aircraft and fly them in to have them on the shelves. So corruption that hinders, sorry, I was timing myself, so I'm over, is a significant impediment. Those are just a few examples. In the CSR space, compliance with human rights, labor rights, and environmental standards is a huge issue. And the pressure on global companies to adhere to these things is increasing constantly. Now many institutional investors, in addition to activists, in addition to governments, many institutional investors are pushing companies to comply. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the largest holder of equities in the world, and there's more money in the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund than in any other fund on earth, either public or private. The Norwegians are setting stricter and stricter and stricter standards for human rights, labor rights, and environmental compliance, and they're not shy about funding investigations of specific companies, demanding specific actions, and so we've gone beyond the tradition of companies being concerned about campaigns about bad behavior. This is now about your share price, and that really gets the attention of business. Well, when you have suppliers around the world in countries that don't enforce environmental norms, when in some countries cotton, some of the major suppliers of cotton in the world use child slave labor to harvest cotton, you've got a major problem. And those are just a couple examples of the challenges that that companies face. And the scope of issues is broadening. In the last year or two, we have seen an enormous expansion of the focus on what's called gender-based violence, sexual harassment and coercion in the workplace. I mean, it's always been there, but this is now front and center. And so the range of issues that companies have to address is also growing constantly and dramatically. And if you don't have good governance, if the laws aren't enforced locally, because most of these countries, the vast majority have good countries on the, good laws on the books. If they're not enforced, if there isn't transparent governance, if you don't have all these mechanisms that are the foundation of democracy, the companies have to self-police. So these global companies become the police force for behavior in these other countries, something that they spend many, many millions of dollars doing, and yet it's still inefficient because they can't prosecute people, they can't jail people. Their ability to enforce these norms is very limited. So without these governance and rule of law mechanisms, they are often hamstrung. I'll save most of the rest of what I've got to say for Q&A, but let me just say, you are starting to see some advocacy from business. That's new. Business isn't always comfortable as an advocate for these kinds of issues in foreign markets, but the problems have become so acute that you are seeing some advocacy. I think because the ability of businesses to affect these issues is limited, I think CIPE's work in this space is particularly important because it's hard to corral business into taking on these mega issues. So having an outside organization take it on and really look at the full scope of what affects the rule of law and governance in these countries is incredibly valuable to business.
Thank you, Claude. That seems like a good segue to go back to Andrew, because I want to get your sense of how we would prevent this race to the bottom, essentially the sort of worst-case scenario that Claude has described with the impact of corrosive capital. What can organizations, what can civil society in these countries do, what can donors do to encourage a better approach?
Thank you, Shanthi. I think that's where the secret lies is that a lot of these rule of law practices need to be demand driven, and there is a role for multinationals to play as potential investors in economies. But as Claude mentioned, they are competing with capital from countries that aren't demanding things. And if you're a local business practitioner, it's often easier for you to do a deal with people who aren't going to be asking you to raise your standards, even though in the long run you're probably better off getting your company ready for globalization than not. So we need to be supporting, I think, the demand side of this equation. And I think civil society plays a very important role within that equation. I think we're already starting to see some of the impact of its work merely because of the fact that we're talking about this. This is an issue that our local partners are generating, that I know other civil society organizations are starting to look at, especially those who work in anti-corruption and transparency issues. But we really do need to be looking at how can we build awareness in countries around the world as to the true cost of the debt or the true cost of a program or a project, both in terms of debt, but also in terms of, as Claude mentioned, all these other standards that we need to be concerned of in a modern marketplace. And they need to be demanding these things of their officials and of their governments. The big thing you hear when China holds a conference or when China talks about the nature of its capital is that China will say, we don't believe in interfering in the affairs of a local state. Our money is no strings attached money. Local sovereignty is more important. Okay, if that's the case, then we have to respect local sovereignty in the terms that citizens need to be able to demand more of their own government as well, even if that might go against the interests of expedient capital flows. So empowering those people locally on both the scrutiny of governments as they take on these obligations, but then as they implement these obligations as well. So there's a role for independent media, there is a role for the business community, there is a role for labor, there is a role for a variety of civil society actors, and we can support that. And I think that's one thing that U.S. programs are very good at doing, and our European friends are very good at doing. We're very good at finding local champions. We're very good at identifying local leadership. And we need to empower those people to hold their governments accountable. We can work at a global level and say these standards are still important, they still matter. We can get the UN and the SDGs and all these things to talk about the importance of high standards and good governance. But if we're not empowering people at the local level to hold their own officials accountable and to build those structures, which takes time, it's not an overnight thing. That's where we need to be. And I think it's important, too, that we empower these groups not only at that local practice, but to participate in global fora where they can demand that those of us who have a place, a seat at the table where we can also affect international standards and global norms, listen to them and take those words forth as well.
I know that we want to get to Q&A, but I wanted to quickly go back to both Lola and Marc, because both of you mentioned the issue of capital flowing into these soft sectors like media and places where public opinion is formed, essentially. And I wanted to get a sense from you, both in looking at the different regions that you've looked at, how is this playing out, and is civil society actually able to make a difference in pushing back a little bit? Maybe start with you, Lola, and then Marc.
Hello? No, not on? Is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Shanthi. I kind of will just start from one of the recommendations Andrew just talked about, which is reinforcing the global norms and global standards, because, China makes has this messaging that, our funds are no strings attached. Which means we don't interfere in domestic policies, unlike, traditional lenders who bother you with, standards of governance. You must make sure that you do things like, a social and impact analysis, social impact assessment before you start a project, But we won't do all that. We'll come in, we'll build it in 3 days, and your rail will be working. And I think we, CSOs, especially in the media, do need to correct that messaging, because a lot of the leaders on the continent echo that. At the forum that I talked about, a lot of the leaders were saying, yeah, this is win-win, but I think it's win ? For the countries that get this capital funding. They say, this is funding that has no strings attached. But I think, no, there is a lot of interference in, well, maybe not a lot, but there are some examples of interference in domestic policies, and just a few quick examples. There's a report that shows how, the perception or the acceptance of, for instance, Taiwan, if you know about the, Taiwan-China relationship, as an independent state, changed as soon as certain African countries started getting funding from China. Now, I think that's a domestic policy issue for the countries that had that decision, because they had special relationships with Taiwan. They voted with the US for Taiwan to stay an independent state, but that changed as soon as they started getting funding for China. The most recent one, I think, was either Chad or another one. But that's just one way. The other, and I'll get to the media, but the other way that, there's a lot of interference in domestic policies really is this condition that countries should boycott their procurement standards when capital from, Chinese government institution is involved. And it's raised a lot of debate, currently very hot debate in South Africa, where the Attorney General, the head Ministry of the Ministry of Justice, has shot very, very, specific letters to the President's office explaining, look, we cannot boycott our procurement laws. You have to go to open bidding for these projects. And that's why funding to the projects in South Africa, have stalled a little bit. Kenya's funding for the standard gauge rail went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that's still a controversial issue. Unfortunately, now they're dealing with the backlash of all of that because the private sector that wasn't involved or didn't know about the negotiation is now suing the government and demanding certain rights. Environmental activists are also suing the government because, there's a lot of damage to the environment, and all of these was not factored in when the negotiations happened. But so back to the point, there is a lot of, interference in, decision-making domestically that this foreign aid plays a very key role in. And then the other interesting thing that we're seeing is investments from, on the continent, the company that, the Chinese-owned company, it's an SOE called Star Times that invests in the media space, is growing rapidly across West Africa and East Africa. In Zambia, the state-owned broadcasting commission is pretty much owned or run or controlled by Star Times, a local company owned by Star Times. And they've ring-fenced somewhere between 60 and 90%. And so this is another thing around transparency of a lot of these deals that involve Chinese firms with local firms. But they've ring-fenced a lot of the revenue that comes from these agencies. But more importantly, all of the policies around the broadcasting space in Zambia is controlled by the Chinese firm, except the editorial policy. And so now they decide who gets a license, which private media firm gets a license, or which one doesn't. And then just recently, there's the news that we received yesterday, or 2 days ago, in Ghana, where the government has kind of agreed with Star Times again to receive free-to-air satellite TVs for like 300 villages. And the Ghana Broadcasting Commission is worried about that because then there's no way to regulate the media, well, not regulate, but to monitor what sort of content gets around the country by the local authorities, the local communication authorities. And so this is a trend that we're seeing in not only Ghana and Zambia. In Nigeria, there's a very interesting relationship between the journalists' communities and I don't think it's the journalist communities in China. It's really just the executive governments have what they call an excursion for journalists. And all journalists get to go to China and have a good time and get shown around and get told what's great about China, and get given little envelopes. In Nigeria, envelopes are an interesting, important thing you get that usually bribes are in, but maybe it's just gifts. And so you don't really see any reports about, Chinese investment and maybe violations of labor laws or how the debt trap might be a problem and the government needs to rethink it. You don't really see any balanced report or reporting about Chinese investments in Nigeria. Now, whether that's linked, it's not clear, but that's definitely an interesting phenomenon. And so I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to taking more questions. I can read wrap up here, so I wrap up.
Thank you. We're already going a little bit into our Q&A time, but I do want to make sure we get to some of the points. I know, Marc, you wanted to go into a little bit more detail about this issue of the media investment.
Sure. Actually, since Lola talked a little bit about media in Africa, why don't I'll take a different angle. How about that? And that way I'll condense my comments so we can get to other stuff. I just want to touch very, very briefly on energy issues, and particularly across the Balkans. And this is, I think, where this issue of strings attached versus no strings attached, and what's the agenda here, and this question of public influence, public perceptions really comes into play. People in the Balkans pay very low prices for energy. This is historically the case, and they have a very limited supplier of energy. It's mostly Russian energy, and gas prices are very low, which means the state is subsidizing energy, right? Now, what that means is that you have Russian state-controlled gas company that is basically buying a lot of goodwill by supplying energy to the state, which the state subsidizes, and then people get their energy cheaply. So, this obviously is an area where, if you were to ask, if you were to give the citizens the opportunity to have open competition for energy, it's possible that prices might go up, but quality might also go up, reliability might also go up, because we've seen, certainly in the case of Ukraine, that when Russia is unhappy with the political decisions that a country makes, it can turn off the taps very easily as well. So, that really speaks to Andrew's point, I think, about countries taking decisions that are not necessarily in the best interests of their citizens, when Russian supply isn't guaranteed. Now, those of us who follow energy issues in Europe may have heard of something called the South Stream pipeline. Okay, this is a pipeline that Russia was trying to build through the Balkans as a way of bypassing Ukraine. Eventually, even though Serbia is not a member of the EU, they're a member of something called the EU Energy Community. And they were forced to abandon the South Stream pipeline project after a lot of European and public pressure. What happens? Immediately after that, Russia and Serbia announced a new project called the Serbian pipeline, the Serbian Stream. Now that project is still sort of in the development and discussion phase. The documents on that are not public yet. It's not clear whether that will go through, but we see this sort of persistence to find sort of a weak spot, in this case energy policy, and continue poking away at it. But when citizens are paying very low prices, they think paying low prices, but the state is actually paying very high prices. We know that at the end it's the public coffers that are gonna suffer from that. You can sort of go across the board. For example, a Russian oligarch became the majority owner of a large aluminum plant in Montenegro. When that company got into trouble, the state started bailing it out. So who are they really bailing out? Well, this is a company that was the largest employer, single employer in the country. It employed, 30% of the population, according to our data. So who's really getting the bailout there? Is it the workers? Is it this company? Well, this is a privately owned company. So again, is this a decision that the state is making in the interest of its own citizens? Or are there other forces at play? Montenegro has, if you look across the Balkans, actually the largest penetration of Russian ownership, particularly, for example, in the real estate sector. So you can start to pick out these individual examples where you see that this capital starts to not just corrode the local governance and economic standards, but also starts to influence political decision-making and sway public opinion. And that, I think, is the issue that we're really following in the Balkans case.
Thank you, Marc. Why don't we, since we are now into our Q&A time, why don't we move to Q&A with the audience, and hopefully our panelists will have a chance to elaborate more based on those, and I'm sure there are a number of questions. So why don't we take a few? There are some microphones that are going around, so let's say first row, second row, and over here on the aisle. And if you could introduce yourself as you ask your questions.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Massaro. I'm the Anti-Corruption Policy Advisor over at the Helsinki Commission. Thank you so much for this terrific panel. A colleague of mine asked me whether I organized this panel, if that's relevant to my portfolio, so it's really great to be here. Andrew, I love the approach, this idea of looking at local standards and trying to build up local standards, seeing as Chinese capital claims to be playing to those local standards so as to reach that lowest common denominator. I'm worried that local standards are playing to Chinese standards, though. That you know, countries, and I've read about this happening in Central Europe, the Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia, where local standards are changed preemptively so as to attract Chinese capital. And now, and I know this corrosive capital focuses specifically on these newer democracies, but there's a worry that this may happen with the United Kingdom post-Brexit, where, you know, capital-hungry countries would change their standards so as to attract this capital. And I'd wonder how this complicates our work of building these local organizations, and what your thoughts might be on that. So, thanks.
Thank you. And over here?
Hello, okay. Joyce Rogers Holiday. I'm the Executive Director of the International Association of African NGOs. Thank you very much for a brilliant and informative presentation. However, what do you say to the governments of particularly African continents who are facing elections? And they're telling you that the Western model of investments is complex, is bureaucratic, it takes too long. You go into several meetings, you chat, you have meetings after meetings after meetings. After the meeting, nothing happens, and you don't meet their requirements, and it's over. Whereas the Chinese model, they tell you, oh, it is streamlined. You tell them what you want, they tell you what they can bring to the table, you agree, and the deal is closed. They're not looking at the long-term effect of the implications of these loans and debt. They're looking at, what do I need to do now? I'm up for election in the next 4 years. I need to show my citizens that the roads are all, you know, well kept. They have airports to travel. And that's what, to them, that's what the Chinese is bringing in. You know, their roads, they can see the roads that have not been, you know, constructed over years. All of a sudden, they have this 4-lane highway to travel on. They're seeing the airports. They're seeing the seaports. They're seeing different infrastructure. To the citizens, that's what they're looking at. And they're saying to them, I mean, some governments would say to me that, okay, Joyce, we've been in bed with the West for over 40 years. We talk and talk and talk, and nothing happens. And this time around, these guys have a different, you know, a streamlined model. You know, they're able to produce, you could see the roads, you could see all. So these are the challenges, and it's an uphill battle. And then you talk about the World Bank. The citizens have also seen double standards. It's like the World Bank and IMF, we as NGOs go to the meetings and we're asking them, why are you funding these governments that have governance issues and accountability issues? And you hear things like, well, you cannot work, we have to work with them. And I haven't seen lately anything from the US side. You know, I went to meetings after meetings last week, these same discussions, and nothing in US African policy that's discussing what's happening. You know, there has to be a shift, or else all roads lead to China for all of these leaders.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there was a question here in the second row, if you could give her your microphone.
Thank you. Oh, is it on? Yeah. Okay. I'm Anjali Kata, and I'm one of the students from Stanford. My question was, I read this theory in a couple of articles that because standard of living is raising in China, even for the unskilled laborers who participate in manufacturing, that there's a preemptive shift for manufacturers to switch like manufacturing to Africa and to utilize the unskilled labor there. And I was wondering if that's true, and if it is, what are the implications in local governance of that?
Thank you. So Andrew, do you want to take that first question, and maybe Lola, you could handle the next two?
Sure. And I think that your question illustrates the broader challenge in front of us, and I referred to it a little bit in my remarks, and that is, you know, are we entering a race to the bottom? Is that a potential impact of what's going on, and how can we avoid a race to the bottom in that regard? You know, I think this idea of the importance of global standards needs to be reinforced, and we need to be self-aware that this debate is happening. That, you know, it's most obvious in the tech sector right now, because that just happens to be where it is. But we are being challenged by African nations to say, you know, why not do a deal with these groups? I think, you know, if I characterize the work that we're doing at CIPE, we characterize it as we're trying to understand the nature of this thing. And I think we are still at a stage in this debate where we're starting to understand the new ley lines, if you will, of where these debates are happening globally. And we're starting to figure out, well, wait a minute, we are paying the price for a lack of leadership that resulted from 2008. Whether the unquestioned superiority of the Western model got called into question, and then we failed to provide the answers. And we have failed to lead, I think, both from a private sector perspective, but also a public sector perspective, a forceful debate in these international fora where these standards can exist. So we need to figure out how do we re-engage on this. We're starting to see the impact of these sort of unrestrained flows. We're starting to understand the nature of the challenge to us on a geopolitical level. I think the private sector, to Claude's point, is starting to see that this is now a business issue. So I think we're starting to get a critical mass here of interests that are aligning that are calling for a better understanding of the nature of the challenge ahead, but also the need to start reasserting why it's good to have these standards. And part of our effort, obviously, is to be more articulate about this, but realizing that there are so many levels to it. So my observation would be we need to re-engage at a global level. We need to reinforce those standards. There are frameworks that exist that we can put some effort into, whether it's the SDGs and calling on the Chinese to play a better role in towing the line on the SDGs, or whether it is to take a look at how our financial markets are demanding governance and trying to reinforce some of that behavior. And then obviously from a development perspective, empowering local groups then to take those global standards and try and promote those at the local level. I'll leave the Africa questions to Lola.
Thank you, Andrew. So to your question about, what do you say to African leaders who say, well, the Chinese model is, it delivers fast, it's more efficient and less bureaucratic. My observations is most of the countries on the continent, the leadership of these countries tend not to have a long-term strategic plan for development. Most of the plans I see, the economic development plans I see, are like 4-year plans or 2-year plans or 3-year plans. I've hardly really seen a 10-year plan, which is not too long, right? And if there is a strategic long-term plan, I expect that they will have a stronger position when they go into negotiations with the IMF or with the World Bank. Another problem is where there is a short-term-ish strategic plan, which is often 4 years, hardly even a 6-year plan, many of the countries on the continent have leaders who are there for 4-year terms. Now, I wonder if it's time for African leaders to start thinking strategically so that they're saying, well, given our peculiar circumstances, should we be having 6-year terms so that we can do more in the time that we have? 6-year terms with no repeats? Those are the sort of questions I think African leaders need to start having so that they can have a strategic plan. So when they go to a meeting with the IMF, they don't sound unready. They sound actually quite ready and maybe make the IMF more confident that they will create the controls back home, that will guarantee that the funds will be utilized properly. Those are my observations. And I was just making a few notes here. This is the big picture, but I do agree that, we are up against, a capital that comes, what they call, without the strings attached, which is, I would say, it's without requirement to meet certain values that, traditional lenders share in common with many African countries, which would be democratic values of, inclusion and the rule of law, right? And the question for African leaders, too, will be, well, you want this efficient financing model, but what's the impact on your country in the long term? What's the impact on your governance standards in the long term? What's even the impact on your economy? Because you should want the bridges and the roads to be built so that you have a better economy, right? You increase economic activity. But in some of these countries, you're seeing that, for instance, in Sierra Leone, they're building an airport, and the assessment from the Chinese firms was that, oh, this airport, you really do need it, a second international airport. With the new government coming in and opening up these negotiations to independent, I think it was KPMG, one of the big fours, did an evaluation of that project, and they found that they couldn't, Sierra Leone certainly would not be able to pay for the airport in 20 years or longer, and that they really didn't need the funds to be channeled to an airport, but they needed the funds to be channeled to a different part of the economy. So the thinking is, are they making strategic decisions that actually benefit the countries, or they are making decisions that would get them elected in the next term? And of course, traditional lenders can see through those kinds of decisions where it's politically expedient to build a road that costs you a lot but adds no value to the economy over time. So also, there's a lot of introspection on the sides of the traditional donors who need to think, well, we're up against capital that's coming without these good strings attached, I'll say. So we do need to rethink how we engage African countries also. So on both sides, there's work to be done, but there's a lot more work, I believe, to be done on the side of the partners locally. And back to Andrew's recommendations, how do we make that happen? Strengthen the local CSOs, increase democratic participation. That's how we can make it happen. But I'm happy to take that up, in more detail later on. And there's one more question to quickly go to. I'll take that one. I'll take that question, or contribution, right? Yeah. Let me quickly go to your question about jobs, about unskilled labor moving to the. I've heard and read about. So this is internal communication in China that we haven't heard on the continent much, but I've heard private investors and entrepreneurs talking about China wanting to offload unskilled labor in the millions to the continent and all of that. I think there's an opportunity there. I think that's a good thing. But I think, to maximize the benefits that might come from that opportunity, African countries do need to, sort of have a strategic plan for themselves also. Of course, this is good for the economy, but what's the long-term impact? We have a report that shows, where Chinese projects are, operating in Africa. There's an increased tendency for corruption and lower governance standards in those regions. We need to fix that. So that's a good thing, I think. It's a good opportunity, but it's one that, of course, with everything, you need to prepare for, and you need to manage to maximize the benefits of those opportunities. And I think Abdu had a question.
Just a sec. I know Claude actually wanted to respond to that issue as well.
Sorry, Abdu, just very, very, very briefly. I think it's a fair criticism of our aid programs that we're too slow, too complicated. And to the point where, with respect to some of our aid agencies, American businesses don't even bother to try to work with them because they run into the same problems that countries in Africa or other countries do, right? Too slow, too bureaucratic. But I think it's worth noting that there's a new piece of legislation that is on the verge of passing Congress. I think it will almost certainly become law this year. It has supports of Democrats, Republicans, and the White House, called the BUILD Act. And it will take the aid agency that is the most business-like, most streamlined, most able to work with business, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, enormously expand its funding authority, and expand the scope of the financing types of financing that they can provide and insurance for developing countries. And one political motivation behind this legislation is the notion that it's needed for America to compete, and it's exactly the problem that you highlighted. With regard to Chinese offshoring of industry, that's something that's happening. I know among companies my firm works with that are global consumer brand companies. This has been going on for years. It is not easy because China is so efficient and is vertically integrated in so many different sectors, but it's happening, and it's driving a boom in Vietnam. Apparel is going to Ethiopia at a fairly rapid clip. So, and the current trade, this is before the current trade war, that's going to accelerate it further. So it's happening on as quickly as companies can do it, but you've got to be able to find other places. If more countries had the infrastructure, workforce, and other competitiveness attributes, that would be happening much faster right now.
So I know there are a number of other questions. So Abdul, I know you had one here, and then over there, and a question over here, and we'll try and do a big round. So
thank you very much, Shanthi, and I'll try to be very brief. My name is Abdul. I'm the managing director of programs at CIPE, and I just wanted to add a small comment. What we've been listening to is the think globally component of this problem, right? So how do we deal with governments? How do we deal with the heads of states in Africa and whether they take the money or not? That's not what CIPE is involved in. We think at this level, but we act globally. So we're not telling them not to take that money, or we're not telling them go take the money from this country or that. What we're trying to do is to identify the governance gaps and then work with local organizations to close these gaps, right? So take the money, but as you're taking it, make sure that these gaps are closed, so it's not just better for you to see the airport fast, to see the highway fast, you're also closing these governance gaps so you don't owe money that you cannot pay, and that's so you have better rule of law, and the civil society organizations are engaged in this. So that's our approach.
thank you. And the woman behind you, if you could hand her the microphone.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm a president of a private company and an organization. I'm based here in Washington, but I'm from Kenya. Thank you so much for your presentation. As go to China, local people, the grassroots, the small people in the rural area have Chinese who speak my own language. In the rural area, they talk to them in the language. So coming back to tell them, do this and this, because they have built schools, hospitals, and common things that they needed, but they don't know what is behind what they are happy of, though they have done a lot. My question is to the private sector. Looking at ACOA, African Growth Opportunity Act, and textiles manufacturing in Africa, though I focus on manufacturing here and in Africa, what do you think now that the Chinese are now in Ethiopia, in Kenya, everywhere, in textile apparel? What is going to happen? Is that textile apparel going to be Chinese-made, African-made, or Kenya-made? They are the same Chinese we are talking about, and if they make clothes and bring here to America and not create jobs, they have their own employees. So what would we call that in the policy? And is that really low on the Chinese part or the African part? So that's what I just want to know on the private sector, but on. Thank you.
And the gentleman over here in the second row.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Mason Navarro. I study at Johns Hopkins Science, and I'm also a European Union citizen. So, of course, we talked about the Balkan countries. Many of the Western Balkan countries have been EU member candidate states for quite a while, and this inflow of Russian money, Chinese money, Turkish money as well is increasingly worrying the European Union. yet the member states and the Commission are divided with regard to how the accession talks should advance. What would you advise the policymakers, both in Brussels and in the member states? Thank you.
Thank you. So, I don't know, Claude, if you want to take the question about manufacturing and textiles, or Lola, either one of you.
I'll let Claude take it.
AGOA, so first of all, I think AGOA's been a blessing, but it's also been a disappointment. The vision for AGOA was that it would bring an enormous amount of light manufacturing to Africa. Most of AGOA imports to the United States are oil and gas. However, it has benefited, it has created many hundreds of thousands of jobs in sub-Saharan Africa in apparel. The way the global apparel industry operates is that much of it is owned by very sophisticated manufacturing companies based in South Korea, Taiwan, China, Sri Lanka, a small number of countries. And so when global brands, the H&Ms, the Inditex, the Gap, and others, when they look to bring production into sub-Saharan Africa, they will go to the manufacturers they know and say, look, we think you should start building plants in Ghana, in Ethiopia, wherever, in order to supply us, because they have the management capability to run the plants. In my experience, most of the vast majority of the workers are indigenous to the country, so the ownership may be foreign, but it's still creating a lot of employment. There are a lot of problems. I mean, a lot of cultural issues between you have Chinese or Taiwanese or Korean managers and indigenous people as the workers. But I think it's a fair question to ask why we can't have more African homegrown manufacturers the way we've seen occur in Bangladesh, where the industry is almost all owned by Bangladeshi business people. And AGOA doesn't really address that at all. I think that's something that's got to be driven by government policies in these countries.
Marc, did you want to address the EU?
Sure. What a great question. Almost so great, you might think I planted it, but I promise that I did not. I'd like to actually tie my answer to your question with Abdu's comment about thinking globally and acting locally. You know, you mentioned these sort of big picture issues, divisions within the EU, challenges with the EU accession talks. You know, I think that if you look at Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans in particular, I think we really lost the thread of what the accession process was supposed to be about. I think we put the cart before the horse in many ways. The focus was supposed to be do these reforms to improve your countries, to improve your economies, strengthen your democracies, improve governance. And if you accomplish all of that, people's lives will improve, and then you'll join the EU. I think we switched it and we made it all about what kind of reforms do you need to put in place on paper to get into the EU. We made it into a box-checking exercise. And then we turn around and we look at these countries that are EU members where corruption is still rife, there's still kleptocratic networks, democracy is still struggling. And these then become very welcome, to bring it back to the topic of today's discussion, become very welcome grounds for Russian capital and other Chinese, Turkish capital to come in and invest. Therefore, I think it's important that we redouble our focus with, and this is what CIPE is doing really in the region, redouble our focus with local business community, local government, local civil society to identify the specific gaps in governance where the reform process has not really come to fruition. Problems in anti-monopoly policy, anti-money laundering, competition policy, procurement law, privatization issues, and address those gaps, close those gaps. And then, then let's look at the question of EU accession later. Let's get these countries on the right track first. And once I think citizens start to benefit from those reforms, then I think it's possible you might actually start seeing a shift in public opinion about EU accession, which has, dropped off in recent years. And then you might start seeing economies become more resilient and more able to repulse this corrosive capital that's trying to come in.
So we are just about out of time, but I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to say, if you were able to issue a call to action and say, this is the single most important thing that should be done now, the most important idea to address this problem of corrosive capital, what's your big idea, your single big idea, and if you could just express it briefly, that would be great. Thank you. Andrew, why don't you start?
I think it's a call to action, to my earlier point, I think it's a call to action on recognizing that there are potentially positive aspects to capital, any capital flow, and we should not be discouraging that. But what we do need to be encouraging is local accountability and local governance, and equipping people to handle the challenge of the investment flows that they're going to be dealing with.
Great.
So it's almost impossible to have a one silver bullet, but I think corruption is a word that has been overflogged, I believe, especially on the continent. But I think that's really, that's the bane of the problem. If we can strengthen local forces, CSOs, private sector blocks, citizens, if we can strengthen them to demand accountability across the board from their leaders, I think that would be, one of the strongest ways to stem the tide of, or the effect, or resist the effect of corrosive capital on the continent.
Claude?
I agree that it's hard to come up with a silver bullet, but I guess if I had to name one thing, it's we need to do better. This needs to be an important focus for ourselves, our government, business community, our allies and international institutions to provide more competitive aid and financing programs, and to work with those in civil society around the world who want the help, where there is an opening. We don't always have the leverage to force changes, but there are openings in many places to aid civil society or help create more space for civil society, to provide more funding, better funding, faster funding, to make financing capital from the U.S. and our allies much more attractive. So I really think the answer kind of starts at home and with us doing a better job.
Well, those are really hard three acts to follow there. I would say information, transparency, and once again information, public debate, scrutiny. Let citizens understand what these flows of money are all about, and let them have the discussion, let them have the debate, let them, through the democratic process, influence what kind of choices their policymakers are making. That to me is the biggest takeaway, so that this money is exposed to the light, and let people decide what are the long run strategic choices that their countries are making, and then let the investment decisions flow from that.
Well, those are all terrific ideas. I've put everybody on the spot by asking them for just one, but of course you'll be able to find a number of other ideas in the report here if you haven't had a chance to look at it. It's both here as well as online. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get into all the different issues, but hopefully you can read the report for yourself and continue the conversation. So please join me in thanking all the panelists here for such a terrific discussion. Thank you very much.
No.